Data fetching is one of the most important things in every application. If you've used Remix for over a minute, the first thing you probably searched in the docs is how to handle data fetching and data submissions. And you probably ran into useFetcher and useSubmit. Well, what's the difference? Let's talk about it. The first thing you need to understand in order to know when to use what is how does Remix work behind the scenes with useSubmit and useFetcher. If you come from the olden days when we used to use PHP and you had no JavaScript submitting the form, the usual flow would be something like this. So imagine with me you have your website set up and you have your localhost/user page, and that page has a form and it has 3 fields on it, so name, surname and age. And what you're trying to do here is you're trying to submit this form to your backend in order for the backend to handle it. So back in the PHP days, what would happen is you would submit to the current route and the controller would take over and handle the data. And this is the default behavior of the actual browser. So what this means is whenever you submit any kind of form in the browser, it's going to submit it to the current route. And how it's going to submit it to the current route, it's going to do the following. So you will have your button. So here is the button, and what you're gonna do is when you click on the fancy button here, the form that wraps all of this is gonna submit. And how it's gonna do that, it's going to take the name, the surname and the age. And there are 2 scenarios that happen once you submit the form. If the method is not set, it defaults to a GET request, and what happens is all these fields get serialized in the URL as search parameters. So name is equal to name, surname is equal to surname, age is equal to age, and so on and so forth. But if you make a post request with the form or any kind of other request, the browser only knows posts, even though servers know patch, put, delete, and so on. What's gonna happen is you're gonna submit to a URL of the current page, but what's gonna happen is you will submit it with the form data. So what's gonna happen is you're gonna submit to the same URL with the form data, and then on the server you're gonna have this form data object that you can parse and do something with. Before Remix, what was really popular is to send JSON to the server, and then the JSON would be parsed by the server and then handled by the server. But why we use form data in Remix? It's because it's the default browser behavior, and then when you submit without JavaScript, it still works the same way. So it's identical with or without JavaScript, and the behavior is consistent, so you don't have to worry what's gonna happen if my client-side JavaScript dies for like a minute. And that's the behavior of forms. Now, the difference between useSubmit and useFetcher is that useSubmit acts the same way that I just described, but the difference between the useSubmit and the default browser behavior is that useSubmit does not reload the page when you submit the info. So what happens is instead of hard reloading the page on the current or different URL, what happens is useSubmit submits to the action without any sort of hard document reload, and then the action gets the data and handles it. And the useFetcher acts almost like an API endpoint where it actually sends the request to a URL, but it does not add anything into the browser navigation history. So what does that mean? So for example, let's say you want to make a GET request from this website, and you want to make it when you land on the website, but when you click back in the browser, you don't want your browser to basically go to the URL you made the request to. So for example, if I delete this, and let's say not the form but the website itself, whenever you land on it, makes a request to user/info. So naturally what's gonna happen is your website is gonna have a history stack, and because you land on this URL, the stack is gonna have this. And once you make a GET request, by default, it would also add this to the stack. So it would look like this. And then let's say you make 5 requests to this, it would fill up the stack like this. And when you click back, it would pop the first one, it would go pop the second one, it would pop the third one, and so on and so forth until you get to the actual page you wanted to navigate to. So what the useFetcher does, it makes the GET request to this URL without adding anything to the history stack. So why this is cool is because you can basically use it to call your endpoints and fetch data without adding in anything into history. And another cool you can do with it is you can make post requests without any sort of navigation. So for example, if this form would submit to a different URL, so if I change this to a post again and I submit to user info, what would happen is after the submission to an action is done, it's going to add another entry into the history that's going to be the user/info, and you're going to navigate to this page. So after the action is done, you're going to be on this page, and maybe that's not the behavior you want to achieve. Maybe you want to stay on the user page, but you want to submit here and not have it in the history stack. That's also another use case for useFetcher. So I want to keep my history stack clean. I want to make a post request to this URL, but I don't want to go there. So basically the difference in essence is, do you want to add that into your history stack, or do you want it to stay where you are? All right, now that we got that out of the way, there's something else I want you to understand. If I go to the Remix docs and I go to the useNavigation here, and if I quickly read through this for you, so basically there are a few properties that useNavigation has, and that's form action, form method, form data, location, and state. And so the state is what's going on the page. The location tells you what the next location is going to be. These form data, form method, and form action tell you what the last form submission was. So was it a GET request? Where was the action? What the form data was that was sent, and so on. So if I go to useSubmit, you can see you can use it to basically submit a form. And then you have the useFetcher here that basically, if you really look into it, also has the same properties as useNavigation. So state, data, form action, form method, and the additional methods of load, submit. It also has the key and the fetcher.Form. So what you need to understand is that useNavigation plus useSubmit plus the form import from remix.run/react is identical to the useFetcher in the terms of properties. So if you want to have the same behavior on the same page, you would need to combine these three to get everything that useFetcher has to offer. Now you might be wondering, why would I ever use these three instead of using just the fetcher? Because it's way easier to do. And there's literally nothing stopping you from just using useFetchers. I personally usually use these three above when I'm submitting to the same route, and when I really don't need to do optimistic UI and stuff like that, or rather I don't use the useNavigation, I just use useSubmit plus the form, and that's it. It really depends on the situation, but whenever you're submitting to the same route, I usually use the top one, and when you're submitting to something else like resource routes, I usually use useFetchers. But like I said, there's literally nothing stopping you from just using useFetchers. The only subtle difference is, do you want to navigate to a new page, or rather do you want to keep it in the history stack? But then again, even useFetchers can redirect, so you are very, very flexible in what you can use. Alright, now that we have that out of the way, let's go back to the docs. There's one final part of the UX that got added relatively recently to Remix, and that's keys on your fetchers. And what these allow you to do is basically look up a fetcher anywhere in your app. So how does this work? It's basically like you define a key on your fetcher, and then you can access it anywhere else in your app. So for example, if you have your dashboard like this, and then you have your navigation on the left, and then you have your top nav bar here, and let's say your fetcher for user info is somewhere here, and you actually have your user image and info here at the bottom, but these are completely different two components. How you can access the data in both of them is by using useFetcher key user. And what this is gonna do is it's gonna feed both this component and this component with the data. And whenever you want to fetch newer data or submit or something, both this component at the bottom and the component on the top will know that something is going on. And if, for example, you want to show let's say you update the image on the top right here, this component automatically knows the image is updated. Let me optimistically show the new image at the bottom left until the processing is done on the server and the data is refetched. Alright, now back to the useFetcher docs. To understand fetcher.Form, the first thing we need to understand is the form component here. And when I talked in the beginning about how forms work in the browser, this form is basically it. The only difference between this form and a regular form is that this form under the hood uses useSubmit to handle your form submissions. And that is really important to remember, because this form basically acts like the normal browser form with the enhanced useSubmit hook. And then the fetcher form that we just talked about has the enhanced form that's tied to the fetcher. So whenever you submit with the fetcher.Form, the only thing that's gonna change is the form action, form data, and state of the fetcher, and it's not gonna affect the global use navigation hook. It's not gonna affect anything else, just the fetcher. So that's the important distinction between the two. So the fetcher submit is identical to the return type of the useSubmit hook. So basically what you get here is identical to what you get in the useFetcher.submit here. And by default it takes the form data instance, the HTML form, or a key value object, and you can use different stuff with it, but we're not gonna cover that because that's not the important part here. And if I scroll down here, another thing you can do with fetchers is load the data from some URL. So for example, if you want to fetch the data on mount with the fetcher, you can do that by using this in a use effect. And another cool thing that you can do is when you're loading this data, you can use the flush sync, which gets passed to the underlying React implementation, which adds it to the flush sync. You can look into flush sync and what it is outside of this video, but that's another cool thing that this does. And now if we go back to the properties here, they are identical to what you get from useNavigation. So state, data, form action, and form method. So the fetcher.data gets filled whenever you return something from a loader via the fetcher.load, or when you submit via fetcher and then you get a response from the action. So that's when the fetcher.data is full, and the fetcher.form data is only filled when you submit with the fetcher. So how you can do optimistic UI is whenever the fetcher.form data is filled and you have the form action and the form method, you use the form data to swap the current data with the one that's being submitted, and once the page reloads because of the loaders and the actions and how everything works in Remix, you get the latest data. So you get optimistic UI for free basically. Alright, and the final thing is, if I go to useNavigation here, if you look at it, you'll notice that you can use the navigation here to get the state of the app. And if I scroll down here, you can get the idle, submitting, or loading states. And what this is useful for is to know what's going on the page. And this only gets changed when you don't submit with a fetcher. So when you submit with useSubmit or the form component. And when you submit with a fetcher, fetcher.state gets changed. And now you might be wondering, okay, how do I know if my fetchers on the current page are being fired off or not? Well, the way you know is you have the second hook that's called useFetchers, and this acts like the useNavigation but for fetchers. So basically what it does is it fetches the array of all the in-flight fetchers. So what this means is whenever a fetcher is submitting or loading data, it's going to be filled in the useFetchers array, and then you can retrieve it from the useFetchers array to know, for example, hey, this fetcher is submitting, hey, this fetcher is loading. So the first thing I want to show you is optimistic UI. So for example, let's say you have a new route that's called resource.counter.ts, and this route exports an action and it returns null, and I'm gonna save this. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna create a const called counter, and it's gonna be 0 at first, and we're gonna export it, and I'm gonna change this to let actually, and I'm gonna save this, and I'm gonna import the counter here in my loader. So we're gonna say counter, and we're gonna return it from the loader, and we're gonna do this. So const data is equal to use loader data, type of loader, so data.counter. We're gonna save this. All right, so we have it at 0. Let's artificially make this slow. So we're gonna do const sleep here, new promise, resolve, set timeout to resolve 2000, and we're gonna await sleep here. We're gonna make this async. We're gonna pop the request from here. We're gonna type it, and then what we're gonna do is we're gonna say const data is equal to request.formData, await, and then we're gonna do const counter value is equal to data.get counter value, and we're gonna return null again, and we're gonna increase the counter, or rather set it to the counter value. And because this is a string, we're gonna do number counter value, and we're gonna save this. And when I'm gonna go back here, what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna use fetcher.Form. I'm gonna set the action to resource/counter, and I'm gonna make the method to be post, and I'm gonna say input name is equal to counter value, and the value we're gonna set it to be counter plus 1, and the button to submit. All right, so I'm gonna submit, and after 2 seconds it updated to 1. All right, and I missed this, so it's not counter plus 1, it's data.counter plus 1. All right, so when I click submit, it waits for 2 seconds, or rather submits to the action, and then increases the counter. And I don't want to wait 2 seconds until the data is done processing before I show this. So what I can do is I can say const optimistic fetcher.formData.get counter value, and then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna say optimistic or data counter, and when I click submit, it's instantly 5, and it just refreshed now. So what did we do here? So basically, when the fetcher is submitting, the form data property is set to whatever you submitted. So we get the form data optimistic value that we just submitted, and then we use that instead of the old data counter from the loader. And because we're submitting to the form action is gonna refresh the whole page, or rather it's gonna rerun the loaders. The loaders are gonna get the updated counter value, and then it's gonna re-render with the fresh data, and we're good to go. We just implemented optimistic UI in 1 line of code. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is pending state. So you don't want the user to click the submit button 20 times until the action is done. So what you can do is you can say const is not idle is equal to fetcher.state is different than idle. So whenever the state is not idle, we're gonna disable the button. So is disabled is not idle. And when I save this and I click submit, the button is disabled. I can click it, and I just have pending state and optimistic UI implemented in like 2 minutes. And that's the beauty of fetchers. Now what's important to note here, you can implement the exact identical behavior with useSubmit, and it works the same way. So you would just not use the fetcher properties, you would use the 2 hooks I mentioned. So useNavigation and useSubmit. And the important thing to keep in mind is, so let me show you what would happen if instead of fetcher.Form you use the form. So if you remember, I said that this form element is the same as using useSubmit. So check out what happens when I click submit. It redirects me to the resource/counter page here, you can see. So why did this happen? As I said, it acts the same way as a normal form does. So you end up on a new page. So the main takeaway from this is only use useFetcher when you want to submit to a route and not go there, and only use useSubmit and form when you want to submit either to the current page or to a new page and actually go there. You could also redirect from the resource route, which would lead you to a new page, but what would happen without the fetcher is you would first have the resource slash counter in your history. So if I go back to Excalibur here, and if we have our stack, the first entry would be the index route. The second entry would be resource slash, and I'm gonna make this a little bit smaller. So resource slash counter. And then let's say you redirect back to the index route. This would be your stack without the fetcher, but with the fetcher, these two wouldn't get added to the stack, or rather the middle entry wouldn't get added, so you would basically end up on the same page here. So that's the difference. The fetcher doesn't add to the stack, but the redirect makes a new request, so that's added to the stack. So that's the subtle difference. And then when you click back in the browser, you would go to the previous page instead of going to the resource route. Alright, now back to Stack Blitz. Another thing you can do is, let's say this is rendered by a different component. So we're gonna extract this into a component, so comp, and we're gonna return basically a fragment with optimistic and data counter. So this doesn't work obviously, so let's fetch this from the loader data, and because the loader data is kind of like a context, it works in the components as well. You just need to be careful that it fetches from the correct use loader data. And then let's say I want to use the fetcher. Oh, and I've been using a custom implementation of the fetcher hook, but I can change this to be useFetcher as well. It would work the same. I'll import it from Remix. And let's say I want to set a key on this. So let's say counter fetcher, and I save this. And I want to use the optimistic value from this component, but let's say this is not in the same file, but it's located somewhere completely different. What I can do is I can say use fetcher with the same key as the one fetcher I'm using here. And what this does is it basically knows the fetcher from the key, and whenever this is submitting, this will know about it. So if I render this and save it, and I also bring the data here because we need it for the counter, you can see it still renders 9 and 10. And check this out. So this is only rendered here, no props passed, no nothing. We just use the useFetcher with the key here, and I click submit, and then I realize I didn't bring back fetcher.Form here, and then I save this again, and now if I click submit, it's an optimistic value and it works again. And isn't this magical? So you just define the key, and from anywhere in your application you can track what's going on with the fetcher that's actually submitting the data in a different component and show something else. And if you want a validator that this has everything to do with the keys, if I save this and now it's a different key and I click submit, this data will be the same for 2 seconds. Watch it now. 1, 2, 3. As you can see, it's tied to the keys and it knows what to fetch. Another important thing is, if you didn't understand what's going on in certain sections, I highly recommend you check out everything you need to know about loaders video and everything you need to know about actions. I'm gonna link the cards somewhere on the screen which go through everything you need to know about what happens when you call a loader, when you call an action, how they work. And that's it about fetchers. Today you learned when to use a fetcher and when to use useSubmit, what the subtle differences are, and how you can fetch data in your projects. But another thing that's really cool that you can do is, for example, if I go to the resource user update route I created, so this is a resource route, and what we're gonna do in here is, let's say I want to get some sort of user data, and let's say I want the name to be a string, and then I want the surname to be a string, and I want to submit that data to the server. I can say user data is equal to user data here, and then save it, and then export this custom fetcher. So what we do here is we say this is the key, and we augment the submit to actually expect the user data to be defined, and this can come from a Zod schema as well. So for example, the user data type would be your Zod.infer that you validate inside of the action here, and then you pass it as the first param here to the submit. And then what you can do is import this custom fetcher. So custom fetcher is equal to use update user fetcher, and then when you do custom fetcher.submit, and I'm just gonna move it into on click because this causes an infinite loop. So here, and as you can see, it's complaining that the user data is not passed in properly. So in order to make it happy, I need to do name is name and surname is potato. And if I save this, now it's not complaining anymore. And you're probably getting a stroke from this because autosave is something you shouldn't mess with. And that's how you can get fully type safe fetchers in order to submit custom data. So for example, if you had a form here that gathers the data, you can call the custom fetcher.submit, and then this would submit your custom data to the resource user update, because we define it in the action here and we say the method is post. So you get fully type safe tRPC-like fetchers in Remix in like just a few lines of code. This is one of my favorite fetcher patterns because you can so easily create so many endpoints for yourself and update data on the fly. You write it once and you're good to go, and that's it. Alright, I really hope you liked this video as well. If you did, feel free to share it with others. Feel free to follow me on socials. I have them linked somewhere in the description, I hope. And that's it. Thank you for watching and see you in the next one. Bye!